Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Data Unchained. I'm your host, Molly Presley. So what is this Data Unchained podcast all about? It's really that the paradigm for data access has changed. How data is being used in today's decentralized world, getting data to remote workers, using the cloud, taking advantage of distributed applications and remote infrastructure is a real challenge for IT teams and also for business units trying to use the data. Data Unchained digs into the challenges as well as some of the solutions that organizations have come up with to make data an asset as a global resource. Today's guest is Jean Marc Holder. He is the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at SeqOne Genomics. Thanks for joining us, Jean Marc.
Thanks for having me, Molly.
So where are you joining from today?
Well, today I'm actually in the headquarters of the company in Montpellier in the south of France. It's where the spring has just sprung, actually.
And you said that it's a bit of a small fishing village, but when we were getting ready to kick off this conversation, that made me feel a little bit jealous. That sounds lovely.
Yeah, it's a great environment, and it's actually made it quite easy to hire talent because people just want to come and work here.
I bet. In fact, you should call me if you ever need some marketing help out there. That's a place I would love to live. Just beautiful. So tell us a little bit about your passion for the industry and kind of your background that brought you to where you are today.
Well, I guess I'm a bit of an outlier because my background, I qualified initially as a naval architect of all things. And the reason for that is because I was passionate about sailing, and I actually participated in the Olympics a good few years ago. And that one led me to try to, become a boat designer and builder. So I started doing that and then slowly got more and more involved in computers and tech and ended up working in the high-tech industry, for quite a while, notably with Apple in Silicon Valley and a few other places like that.
That's a big shift, isn't it?
Definitely. Yeah, and then from there, I sort of started, after years in technology and doing things in online advertising, social media, I kind of wanted to get into something with a more direct human impact. And, obviously healthcare is a big deal. So I started engaging with the healthcare community and found these two great co-founders. And together we launched SeqOne Genomics in 2017.
So SeqOne has been around for just over 5 years or so. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of the founding goals and where you are today with your research and your business?
Sure. I mean, if you look at the sort of high level objectives, is what we say is we want genetic testing to become as easy and accessible as a blood test is today. I mean, that's kind of the mantra behind the company, right? And what we see is that today genetic testing is still quite a luxury or sort of a premium service. Depending on which part of the world you're at, most healthcare services don't cover it very well. So it's only the very wealthy or the very well insured who have access to it. And paradoxically, everything about personalized medicine, which is the main purpose of genetics in medicine, every aspect of that depends on having lots and lots of people being sequenced, both to understand the specifics of a patient or to have the data necessary to sort of draw conclusions about, what therapies make sense. So for us, that's been the driver. How do you make it so that anybody who needs a genetic test can get one at an affordable price in a quick turnaround?
So what is your role in that? It's an amazing mission. What is SeqOne's role in helping to make that happen?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I mean, the way we see it is that right now, very few labs have the technical skills, the people, the resources to do genetic testing. And that means that there's only a few places where you can get tested. And again, if you think of our mission of trying to reduce the cost of genetic testing and improve the accessibility, that has to involve getting more and more labs into a position where they can deliver tests. So what we did is we developed a cloud-based system that actually integrates with the local lab infrastructure and manages the whole genomic analysis process from the raw data all the way through to the final report that'll end up on your doctor's desk. So we don't actually produce the raw data. We aren't a sequencing company. So you buy a box like a scanner, it's called a sequencer, that you put biological samples in and it spits out like a huge file of data. And then from there on in, everything else is done on the SeqOne platform.
Interesting. I've talked to a lot of folks who have thought about, how do you get a sequencer in every doctor's office? And this is more about once that's been accomplished, how do you get the data analyzed, processed, maintain sovereignty, patient privacy, all those
Yeah,
parts? Is
yeah.
that the right way to think about it?
Well, I mean, actually, there's another wrinkle to the whole thing because if you look at it, there are two models for doing genetic testing that you can see. And actually, Europe is very centered on one model, and North America and a few other countries are centered on another, right? In countries like the US, there tend to be very centralized labs, right, that are called central labs, actually. They're big, genomic test vendors. They tend to be somewhat pricey, and they bring all the samples into one place. So they kind of go for the economies of scale. Now, that works fine in some markets, but if you look at the European market, for example, and actually pretty much most other markets, people want to sequence close to the patient for a couple of reasons. One, for data sovereignty reasons. They want to keep control of their data, response time issues. For example, we're doing some interesting projects in the area of the use of genetics in the intensive care units in the emergency room. How can what can do we have a transplant? Can we do a transplant? Is there a donor that matches this recipient? Things like that. So there are really good cases for both of those. If you can think about it long term, things that have a short turnaround time, it may make more sense to do closer to the patient. And we work with companies like Oxford Nanopore that actually have a portable sequencer that you can plug into your USB port and that sequences right there at the patient's bedside. On the other hand, if you're doing a population genetics program, like the English 100,000 Genomes Project or something like that, then it may make sense to centralize everything because cost is everything and turnaround time is slightly less important. So we believe that the future model will have both central and decentralized, and our objective is to handle both of those scenarios with a consistent, cloud-based infrastructure that makes all the data accessible.
Very cool. So your platform is that the right way to call it?
Yep,
Your
that's what
cloud
we call
platform?
it.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
So tell me just a little bit more about how is the data ingested once it gets there? Are you using proprietary applications that you have written or prefer? Can you tell us a little bit more about the data once it gets into your platform?
Yeah, and I'll have to kind of explain a little bit about how genomic testing works. All right, so you have your raw data that comes out of a sequencer. Now, the first complexity you get is that different labs will use different sequencers, different chemical reagents, and different processes. So there's a heterogeneous input. And one of our jobs is to understand those differences and adapt to them. So we will actually automatically detect what sequence you're on. We'll adjust some of the settings on our platform accordingly so that at the end, all the data that's sitting on our platform is consistent.
So when you receive information, is it kind of like a picture that has some embedded metadata about where the photo was taken? Is it kind of like that? Does the sequencer apply some
Yeah, yeah,
information to the sequence?
yeah, exactly. I mean, the sequencer will actually have a unique identifying code. It'll tell you what model it is. It'll tell you a bunch of stuff like that. Some stuff you don't pick up from the sequencer, like which reagents were used. But so, either way, you get this file, and the files can be quite big. Just to give you an idea, the human genome is 3 billion letters long. So that gives you an idea of the size of the files we're dealing with. It's several gigabytes. Between 50 and a terabyte, depending on how much resolution you put into the sequencing. And then, so once you get it up, you have this sort of jigsaw puzzle because you don't read the genome in one bit. You have to sort of read it in chunks and then fit the chunks together. And then you have to compare that with a healthy genome to see where the mutations are. And this is where the first difficulty comes because, well, guess what? If you are, say, a North African or a North American or a French person, the standard genome is actually different, right? So you don't have one reference genome. So there are now projects to make reference genomes per ethnicity so that we can get those variants out. Once you've detected the variants, then comes another problem, which is depending on what you're trying to do, you might need to compare a patient's genome with his parents to see if there are new mutations. You might want to look for the mutations that are related to cancer. You might be looking for DNA in the blood. I mean, there's lots of different things you do. So what we've done is we've implemented a kind of an app store-like approach where we have different applications which address different needs. Some of those applications we develop in-house. Others we develop in collaboration with research establishments, industrial players, and so on and so forth. So at the end, we have all these different apps, which again make it easier for a lab to just say, okay, I'm trying to do this test. Let me just use the liquid biopsy app, upload my data to that, and run it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's basically the flow. Upload the data, which can be automated. We then do the alignment and all this sort of preparatory work, which is called primary and secondary analysis. And then we have a suite of apps which do all the sort of the heavy lifting in terms of making medical sense of what we've got. And then we go all the way through, in some cases, to therapeutic recommendations where we say, hey, this person has this type of cancer, for example, and this cancer responds very well to X drug.
And do you primarily focus on getting to that recommendation or the treatment with the healthcare provider or patient, or are you also aggregating that data for ongoing research?
Well, a bit of both. I mean, clearly, one of the objectives is to come up with a clinical report that the doctor can use as part of his therapeutic strategy, right? And again, in some cases, for rare diseases, it might be just getting a diagnosis may be a huge thing, right? Because people suffering from rare diseases often go through what's called a diagnostic odyssey, where for 6 or 7 years they have no clue what they have, and they're just going from doctor to doctor, and the doctor's telling them, look, I don't really know, take an aspirin, call me in the morning. And finally just telling them, this is what you have, and these are the steps you can take is huge. Then obviously for other diseases like cancer, getting as far as a therapeutic recommendation is the objective. So that's from the patient standpoint, and honestly, we are patient-centric, patient-first. But another important part of treatment is collecting data, which allows us to learn more from the patients we've analyzed, to then be able to say, hey, wait a minute, all the patients with this type of cancer seem to have this mutation, and this mutation impacts this medical or biological process. So maybe if you can come up with a drug which addresses that, we might have something. Now, the challenge with using the data like this is, of course, we need to have authorization to do so. Patient consent, as it's called. And that can be a tricky thing to get, especially in the context of GDPR, the European Data Protection and Privacy Law, which says that you have to get pretty specific consent from the patient. So that's one of the things we're working on all the time with our customers, because remember, our customer isn't the end patient. It's the healthcare provider who is sequencing data and who is buying our solution in order to, provide services to the patient. So we work with them both to get patient consent, and some say yes, some say no. Sometimes it's a sort of a partnership where we say, okay, let's get the consent and let's together see what we can do with this data, right? And then the other thing is that genetic data is great, but you also need to have clinical data, patient outcomes. You need to know what's happening with the patient so you can correlate whatever you see genetically with what's actually happening with the patient. And that's really the fundamental idea behind personalized medicine. Understand your patient better than just generally, he's got breast cancer, but what exactly are the mutations driving it? And that's what helps you to personalize the treatment, which is, I think, one of the objectives we have to get to, as a society in order to improve healthcare outcomes.
So I do want to talk a little bit about the data and how you're moving it around, some pieces like that. But I'm really curious on that piece around personalized medicine, and as you're talking about access to medicine for maybe the wealthy or the insured. Are you able to accomplish that even in some of the countries or economies where there's not so much wealth or insurance is set up differently?
Well,
how is that coming along in the world?
I wouldn't sit here and tell you, yeah, that problem's been solved, right? I mean, it clearly has
Yeah.
not. I think what we're trying to do, I mean, already, if you can look at the difference between what I call the single payer markets, where there's like a national program that's paying for stuff, and then the sort of the private healthcare systems, or the sort of segmented healthcare systems. I don't know what the right way to describe those is. So in one case, in the single payer systems, you need to bring a huge amount of clinical proof to say, yep, this is worth doing for all 60 million or 70 million French people, or You really have to. While in markets where you have private healthcare insurance, many of these insurers use access to sophisticated treatments as a differentiator and an incentive to buy that particular insurance. So right now, I think that genetics is really at its infancy. We're really just looking now at very specific things like cancer treatment is a big area, certain somatic or certain other diseases are a big area, inherited diseases definitely, but again rare diseases. Where I think we need to get to ultimately is to move out of just fixing people once they're broken and get to the point where you're into prevention. Because you can see very early on when people have predispositions to certain things. And clearly, as the population ages, as healthcare costs continue to increase, we need to be better at addressing medical problems before they happen rather than trying to catch up after the fact. So, I believe that in time, that'll be the big aha moment, the huge medical transformation. But until now, what we are doing is we are reducing the cost of sequencing. We're making a platform, and this is one of the things we try to do at SeqOne Genomics, is make a platform which is compatible with lots of different reagents and sequencers so that the labs can pick the right technologies for them. And the cool thing that you see right now is that after years of having very few players in the market, we're now seeing an explosion in the number of sequencer producers, reagent suppliers. So you're getting people who are like ultra low cost, some are ultra accurate, some of them are ultra fast. And that's kind of cool because all of a sudden you can right size your technologies, and that will necessarily reduce costs and therefore improve access.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember that, just Illumina and a few Southern California companies were the name of the game not that long ago. And now there's so many companies out there with so many innovations. It's great to see. Do you share data much? When you think about all these different organizations that are coming about, do you share data across organizations, or is that more done in a country or a healthcare level? Where does the data sharing really occur?
Again, we don't own the data we process, all right? We're just a facilitator. So as I mentioned earlier, what we'll do is we will work with the healthcare provider, who is usually the interface with the patient, and say, okay, so if you're looking at research projects, yes, that clearly often happens, right? 5 or 6 institutions will get together and say, look, we want to do a study on, ovarian cancer. So let's pool our resources. We'll get like a couple of, several thousand patients enrolled, and then there'll be some analysis done on that. You also have initiatives that are at the national level, like the France Médecine Genomic program that we're actually one of the suppliers to. Or it's a bit like the Cancer Moonshot in the US or the UK Genomic Project. So you have those national initiatives, and you even have international initiatives of different types. So in Europe, there's a Million Genomes project, which is bringing together 20 countries contributing, data. And similarly, you'll see international collaborations in the Pacific and so on. So there is a lot of sharing. I think there's, one challenge is, there's a concept in data called FAIR, findable and interoperable, accessible, and reusable, right? Getting data that is, consistent, that you can say, okay, I can compare these things, is tough because some people will sequence just the genes related to certain cancers. Some will sequence the whole thing. Some will use one type of sequencer, some will use another. And all of these things introduce noise and complexity. And this is one of the things we spend a lot of time working on, is how you use, machine learning to denoise and de-silo the data so that it becomes something consistent that you can really make decisions on. So the trade-off that you have to make is between having lots of data that's very inconsistent and actually not that useful, and having maybe smaller data sets that are somewhat curated and that have a lot of pre-production work done on them, and which make them potentially more useful. Like, for example, when we sequence, we will notice what batch a patient comes from, okay? So you normally sequence what's called a run. You don't just do one patient at a time, you do 50 of them. So we'll then look to see if there are any mutations that are abnormally frequent. If half of the patients have this one mutation, then the chances are it's an artifact. It's not really, a mutation. So we'll actually track that and we'll remove those. So there's a lot of work and intelligence that goes into how we structure the data. And we then pour the data into a data lake, which is designed to be aware of the different types of mutations you have and the different genetic information. So, a copy number variant or a SNP or, structural variant are all handled differently. And having all that semantics in there means you can do much more interesting and richer data mining.
Interesting. So can you talk a little bit about the technology stack? You mentioned you're up in the cloud. How do you get the data from the sequencers to your platform once it's there? Are you storing it in many regions, many locations? Maybe just talk a little bit about the IT
a little
side.
bit. Again, now I'm not the technology guy here, right? So
That's okay.
I could
That's
give you a
okay.
sort of a high level idea. So if you look at the workflow, we will start at the sequencer, and then for smaller installations, they actually do it by hand, the way you would upload a file to Google Gmail. You just like drag and drop. If you've got like a bigger installation, we'll actually have a piece of software called the SeqOne Data Sync that'll actually plug into the sequencer. It'll plug into the electronic patient record. It'll plug into the laboratory information management system and pull lots of information in. Right? Now, that's extremely important because, for example, having this metadata can be useful in terms of prioritizing the mutations, right? One of the biggest challenges we have is that it's really hard to hire qualified geneticists or biologists who understand, genetics. And as you scale the volume of patients that you're treating, you need to do increasing amount of decision support. You need to help a lot more. So if you know the symptoms of a patient, you can then look at which genes are known to be associated with those symptoms, and you bring those up and you say, hey, it's probably these 3 genes. Have a look at those first, and if it ain't that, we'll give you some other choices, So we're doing a lot of work pulling in metadata. We then, as I said, are tracking things like what's run or batch it's in, things like that. From there, a lot of our stack uses open source components that are parts of what are called bioinformatic pipelines. So those are sequences of steps that sort of do things like, align the bits of the jigsaw puzzle, compare them with other people, associate them with known information, things like that. And each pipeline addresses a particular medical problem. So for example, if you're doing cancer, the mutations aren't in every single cell, they're only in the cancerous cells. So you'll have a mix of healthy and cancer cells in one place. You need to separate those, right? If you're doing a hereditary disease, then every single one of your cells should have it. So the pipeline is different. And what we then do is we benchmark every single one of these components regularly. We keep monitoring for new ones, so we keep the state of the art on our platform. And when we talk to the medical community, if they say, yeah, but we also need to have detection of, this particular thing. If we don't find a good module, then we'll develop a custom module for that and include that in our app, in the pipeline. And then obviously, as time goes by, we continually benchmark the open source and depreciate our custom modules in favor of the open source where possible, because we're a great believer in the open source and the power of the open source. Okay, so that's kind of how the flow works. And then at the end of it, we have a user interface piece, which is, basically we design it to be very visual, again, to try to make it super easy for the people interpreting this data to have all the information they need in one place. And so that's kind of the flow. The stack is built on, the standard open source stuff, Go and, Elastic. And I couldn't really give you the stack in detail. In terms of the infrastructure architecture, it's big. I think we have like 50, 60 boxes running per install. We tend to host on multiple providers because you have one issue that, depending on which country you're in, quite a few countries have an in-country hosting requirement. So, we have quite a few countries, like in Europe, a lot of countries are happy with an in-Europe hosting. So we have, 1 or 2 host installs that are, in the EU, in France, and I think in Germany we have another one. And then, as requested, sometimes as we enter a new geography that has this sort of requirement, we'll fire up another instance. I don't know if that answers your
Excellent.
question.
Yeah, that's great. I am curious, for countries that don't have the cloud, can they access your platform, or is that an area for innovation? I'm thinking I have a home in Costa Rica, and really the cloud's not a big thing there yet. How do you
No,
help
yeah.
companies or folks in countries like that?
No, I mean, well, there's another. I mean, this is something that's on our roadmap, but we haven't done yet. I mean, as a startup, you have to kind of, pick your battles and do them in order. And clearly there is a requirement. There's demand in some countries for on-premises or in-country installs, right? So on-prem has a number of challenges, especially when you think about clinical certification. There's a lot of like FDA certification or CIVDR certification. That's kind of harder to do on an on-premises instance because you need to certify the installation and the infrastructure as well. And doing that like 10 or 12 times is a huge headache. And also, frankly, the places that require this often don't have a big, patient flow. So for now, it's clearly something on our roadmap. I expect we'll get to it by end of this year. But our priority has been until now on people we can serve with the cloud.
Makes sense. So where do you see things going, not just for your company? I'd like to hear where you see the next few things going for SeqOne, but for the industry as well. Kind of how do you see this industry and kind of the patient care in the next 1 or 2 years really evolving? Are we kind of at a kind of a plateau right now, or do you think there will be a lot of changes in the coming
No,
years?
I truly think we're just at the beginning. I mean, there are many signals that seem to indicate that things are going to move very quickly. One of them we've touched on already, which is there's increasing competition in terms of the underlying technology providers, and that's always very healthy because it drives down prices and increases the breadth of the offer. So you get technologies that are better suited to any particular application. So that's one whole thing, right? And we've already seen prices actually had plateaued for a little while in sequencing, and now they're dropping super fast. I mean, just to give you an idea, I'm sure you're familiar with Moore's law. Actually,
Sure.
Gordon Moore just
Just
died like
passed
2 weeks
away.
ago, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
he's been in the news
and
quite a lot recently.
yeah, and the only technology that's reducing prices more quickly than predicted by Moore's law is sequencing. All right, so we're going from a $2.5 billion sequencing of the first human genome 25 years ago to a sub $100 genome today. Okay, and what that means is if you think of $100 in the context of cancer care for 1 year, right?
It's nothing,
It
right?
doesn't even, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is the ways we're going to be using genetics, right? We're going from theranostic, diagnostic today. I tell you what you have, I tell you what you should take for it. We're now going to be moving into early detection of cancer, which is a huge thing because, there are companies out there that are developing technologies to detect cancer at an earlier and earlier stage. And we're one of the companies doing this. There are companies like Grail as well as doing it. There's a few of them. So all of a sudden, if you think about it, what if I tell you that, next year you can take a blood test that'll tell you if you have cancer? I mean, you could imagine anybody over the age of, say, 30 being eligible for that, right?
Literally life-changing in a lot of
Oh,
ways,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
probably saves a lot of money on treatment, right?
Well,
Catch it early, it
exactly.
saves money, and it's a better patient outcome.
Right, because the earlier, and this is documented, the earlier you diagnose a cancer, the better the survival rates and stuff like that, right? And then if you take it to the third level, which is something I alluded to earlier, right? When you start getting into prevention, you say, okay, I'm going to screen everybody for these 15 or 20 well-known diseases. Then all of a sudden, you can kind of begin to anticipate. You can tell parents, okay, look, you have to be aware that you have a risk of transmitting this disease to your kids. Or, so you might want to, be medically supervised during your pregnancy. Or, hey, you have a vulnerability to breast cancer, so you may want to take more frequent tests, than somebody who has a lower risk factor. So if you add all these things together, you get closer and closer to a, everybody sequenced at birth kind of kind of model. So, that won't happen next year or anything like that because, the society has to fund it. You have to prove that it works and all that. But, clearly there's a lot going on there. And I think that those are all going to be exciting. And of course, to enable this, this is probably in line with, with why we're here. We need to find ways to make the data much more available so we can learn and demonstrate clinical utility on all this stuff, And I think, the challenge today is that, I think governments have to play a part in this. I'm British. I lived in the U.S. for many years, so I see different philosophies depending on which part of the world you're in. But clearly, a lot of European countries have erred on the side of data protection, privacy, respect for the individual's rights, which I think is obviously the right way to go. Right? You don't want to be in a world where you can't get insurance because you had a genetic test which says that you're going to get cancer. That would kind of suck, right?
Right.
On the other hand, personalized medicine, as I said before, depends on having access to enough clinical data to make inferences and then and globally draw correlations between the genetic and the patient outcome. So finding a way to balance that and exposing the right data to each person, I think, is key. And if anything, what happened in data protection with GDPR, I think is a great example. I mean, it is a bit of a pain. As a company, you have to jump through a few hoops, and it's not, it is a little difficult and it costs. But in a way, it creates trust between, the consumers, the society at large, and the companies using data because they know that, there's some oversight. So I think a similar thing adapted specifically for healthcare data would be a huge plus and would really accelerate the adoption of personalized medicine and genomics.
So who can help with this? If you think about, our audience has a lot of technologists and senior leaders of companies and things like that, but driving the governments or the regulations, the data sharing policies, where will that come from? Will that come from patients asking for it, doctors asking for it, technologists, government regulation?
I think it's going to be a sort of a D, all of the above kind of answer. Clearly, patient advocacy groups are great because they vote, so governments listen to them. So they're clearly one of the groups, but they don't necessarily have all the information. So I think it's a combination of the academic researchers, the patients, and industry that all have to lobby for this, and at the same time who have to be ready. And I'm speaking now as an entrepreneur, as somebody in the private sector. There has to be a constructive dialogue. I don't care, I want all the data, and we'll trust us, we won't screw around with privacy isn't going to cut it. There needs to be some willingness to say, okay, I'll accept some oversight in exchange for this access, and we'll agree together on what's acceptable and not acceptable. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I don't think one group is going to solve this problem alone. I think everybody does. Clearly, governments are, like with many of these digital technologies, quite far behind current reality. It's interesting to see what's happening with, AI right now, all the discussions around that. Governments are, miles behind what's going on.
The Wild West.
Yeah, and I think that, we have to educate government, we have to lobby government, we have to prove that it makes sense because, the default position for governments tend to be, look, it's going to cost us quite a lot more money to do all this sequencing. So, we don't really want to do it unless, there's some demonstrated cost savings coming down the line. And ideally pretty quickly, So, there was a great piece of work, I forget who did it now, but I saw a study recently where they kind of looked at all the medical data available on, incidents, how often people get a certain disease, the cost of the disease, and so on. And they said, okay, what happens if we screened for these 20 diseases right away? And, the paper was able to demonstrate that, even today, costs would increase, but the patient benefits would be tolerable for society in terms of, the cost benefit that societies are willing to accept, and that as the cost of sequencing goes down, we would very quickly get to a place where we actually save healthcare dollars by doing this. So it's obviously it's a simulation, it's a paper experiment, But, I think that's very encouraging. And I do believe that, in the future, genetic testing and personalized medicine will be the way we really lick this sort of this escalating healthcare cost problem and really deliver better healthcare and better quality of life to patients the world over.
So that's kind of win-win for everyone. It sounds kind of kitschy, but it's true. If you can save money and have better outcomes, and why not get on board?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yes. Hey, Jean Marc, thank you so much for joining the show today. Really interesting conversation, and your experience spanning so many parts of this, but not just the world of genomics, but the IT services that have developed and whatnot. It's really interesting to see where you've come in your career and what your mission is at the company. We'll definitely be enjoying watching as you guys progress, and if you can accomplish your mission, that'll be great for all of us.
And maybe I could loop in some of the more technical people and see if we can talk more about tech stacks and things like that at another time. Who knows?
Yeah, we'd love to follow up with you on that. That'd be a great second edition.
Great. All right, Wilson, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure chatting. And,
great to chat with you too.
All the best.
Thanks for listening to Data Unchained, powered by Hammerspace. To learn more, visit hammerspace.com. If you have a guest you would like to hear on the show, email me at molly@hammerspace.com.